The last sliver of a blood-orange sun bled out behind the jagged peaks of the Seraphine Mountains, plunging the valley into a deep and sudden twilight. From his vantage in the highest tower of the Obsidian Keep, King Kazima watched the final embers of daylight die, feeling a familiar restlessness stir in the hollows of his ancient bones. For 7 centuries, he had watched this same sun set, a relentless, cyclical performance that had long ago lost its novelty. The world turned, seasons bled into one another, empires of men rose and crumbled to dust, and he remained. An immutable fixture carved from night and stillness. His study was a cavern of shadows and silence, walled with books bound in dark leather and filled with the hushed scent of aging paper and beeswax. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing over the severe lines of his face, catching in the silver threads that now wound through his black hair at the temples, the only visible sign of his impossible age. He was supposed to be reviewing trade pacts with the southern baronies, the parchment scrolls laid out on his great oak desk like pale, sleeping bodies. But the words swam before his eyes, a meaningless litany of tariffs and borders. His focus was fractured, his mind 1,000 leagues away, lost in the vast, empty expanse of his own unending existence. A soft knock at the door, a sound so gentle it was nearly swallowed by the fire's hiss. He did not need to grant permission. The door opened, and she entered, a pool of warmth and light in the cold, cavernous room. Ilara. His queen. His impossible, mortal, breathtaking queen. She carried a small silver tray bearing a single crystal goblet of wine. Her movements were a quiet poetry, a stark contrast to the rigid, predatory stillness of his own court. She wore a simple gown of deep blue velvet that drank the firelight, her hair a cascade of warm brown waves falling over one shoulder. In a world of marble and moonlight, she was earth and sun. He had stolen her from that world, a beautiful, vibrant flower plucked and brought to a place where nothing ever grew. He had made her a queen, but in doing so, he feared he had also made her a prisoner. "I thought you might be weary," she said, her voice a low, melodic murmur. She set the tray on the corner of his desk, her fingers brushing against a stack of neglected treaties. Marius said the council was taxing today. Kazima's lips tilted in a smile that did not reach his eyes. Marius is a master of understatement. They were vultures, as always, picking at the scraps of a kingdom that has outlasted their grandfathers' grandfathers a dozen times over. He reached for the goblet, his long, pale fingers closing around the crystal stem. Her hand lingered near his, and the faint, living heat of her skin was a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. He could feel the delicate, frantic pulse in her wrist, a tiny, fluttering drumbeat counting down the seconds of her life. It was a sound he both cherished and resented, a constant, ticking reminder of the one thing he could never give her, more time. "You should not worry yourself with such things," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He took a sip of the wine. It was a rich, dark vintage from the sun-drenched southern slopes, but on his tongue, it tasted of little more than ash. Nothing tasted right anymore. Ilara did not move away. She studied his face, her gaze full of a knowing tenderness that he found both comforting and deeply unsettling. She saw too much. In her soft, human eyes, he was not the eternal king, the creature of myth and terror. He was just Kazima. Tired, frayed, and impossibly old. "You are far away tonight," she observed quietly. She rested a hand on his shoulder, her touch a small, warm weight that felt heavier than any crown. "Is it the trade pacts? Or something more?" He wanted to tell her. He wanted to unload the crushing weight of centuries, the profound, soul-deep boredom of immortality. He wanted to explain the feeling of being a mountain, watching the river of life flow past, unable to join the current. He wanted to tell her that every sunrise felt like a judgment, every sunset a repetition of a line he'd forgotten the meaning of. He wanted to confess that his love for her was a desperate, selfish thing, a way to feel the sun on his face again, even if only through her warmth. But the words were stones in his throat. How could she, with her brief, brilliant flicker of a life, ever understand the endless, grey expanse of his? "It is nothing," he lied, turning his face toward the fire. "The usual burdens of a king." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Burdens. Her hand tightened on his shoulder for a fraction of a second, a fleeting, almost imperceptible spasm. Then, it retreated. "Of course," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I will let you work. Do not stay up too late. The dawn comes so quickly." She turned and left as quietly as she had entered, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her, restoring the room to its former state of shadow and silence. But it was different now. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was accusatory. Her scent of lavender and clean linen and the faint, sweet smell of her living skin lingered in the air, a ghost of the warmth that had just fled. Cazimir stared into the fire, the goblet heavy in his hand. He had not meant the word as a barb aimed at her, but as he heard its echo in the sudden emptiness of the room, he realized it did not matter. A burden was a burden. And she, in her goodness and her light and her heartbreaking mortality, was the heaviest one he carried. She was his anchor to a world he no longer felt a part of, and some nights, the chain felt unbearably tight. He craved the cold, clean freedom of the abyss, the uncomplicated solitude he had known for centuries before her. He drained the goblet in one swallow, the wine doing nothing to burn away the chill that had settled deep within him. The armory was Cazimir's sanctuary, a place of cold iron and worn leather, where the only demands were those of strategy and steel. It smelled of whetstone dust and polishing oil, a scent that cut through the cloying sweetness of incense and ancient stone that permeated the rest of the keep. Here, surrounded by the tools of war, he could almost forget the silken trap of his throne. He ran a gloved thumb along the edge of a newly forged broadsword, its balance perfect, its steel singing with a low hum that resonated in his bones. Marius stood beside him, a monolith in dark, practical leather. His old general, his confidant, his friend. Marius's face was a roadmap of battles won and lost, his loyalty as unyielding as the mountains that ringed their kingdom. He was one of the few who remembered Cazimir before the crown, before Elara, before the weight of this prolonged, unnatural peace had settled over them. The reports from the northern border are unchanged, Marius said, his voice a low rumble. The Lycans are restless, but they keep their distance. It is the season for it. Their blood runs hot before the first snow. Let it run hot, Cazimir murmured, not looking up from the blade. As long as it runs on their side of the river, he placed the sword back on its rack, the clang of metal onward echoing in the vaulted space. He felt a familiar, predatory itch beneath his skin, a yearning for a clean fight, for the simplicity of fang and claw. It was a craving he had suppressed for decades, for her. For Elara, who flinched at the sight of blood, who believed in mercy as a virtue, not a strategic tool. This peace, Cazimir began, turning to face his old friend, his voice tight with a frustration he could no longer contain. This long, stagnant peace. It's making us soft, Marius. It's making me soft. Marius's gaze was steady. He had heard this lament before, in varying forms, for the better part of a century. Peace has kept the kingdom prosperous. It has kept our people safe. Safe, Cazimir scoffed, the word tasting like poison. He began to pace the stone floor, his long strides eating up the space between racks of spears and shields. Safe and suffocated. I spend my nights drowning in parchment and my days mediating squabbles between merchants who fear the sight of their own shadows. Is this what we fought for? To become glorified accountants. There was a time when my name was a terror, whispered in fear from the coast to the steppes. Now I am a figurehead. A relic. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. Every decision is measured, weighed. I cannot move without considering the consequences, the alliances, the optics. I cannot even hunt freely in my own forests without a dozen courtiers fainting at the thought of offending some minor woodland spirit. Elara has read about in one of her books. The name was out before he could stop it, sharp and resentful. Marius's expression remained impassive, but a new stillness came over him. The queen has brought a gentler age, my king. There is strength in that, too. Is there? Cazimir's laugh was harsh, humorless. She is good. She is kind. She is everything this world is not. And I am bound to her, bound to this performance of domesticity. This constant, vigilant tenderness. It is a cage, Marius. A beautiful, sunlit cage, but a cage nonetheless. I have to guard my every word, my every instinct. I have to pretend to be a man she can love, a gentle king from one of her stories. Before her, my life was my own. My nights were my own. I was free. He finally stood still, the confession hanging in the cold, metallic air between them. She is the anchor that keeps me grounded, yes, but some days, I feel like she is the stone that will eventually drown me. She is a constant, living reminder of everything I am not, and everything I have given up. It is a burden, Marius. A beautiful, terrible burden. He had said it. He had given voice to the ugly, treacherous thought that had been festering in the dark corners of his heart. A profound sense of release washed over him, immediately followed by a wave of self-loathing. Neither of them heard the faint scuff of a soft-soled shoe in the corridor outside. Neither of them saw the shadow that froze by the heavy, iron-strapped door. Elara had been on her way to the kitchens, a small, hopeful plan in her mind to procure the honeycakes he had once mentioned he'd enjoyed as a mortal boy, a story he'd told her one soft, firelit evening. She carried a small, empty basket. Her hand was raised, about to knock, to ask if the king or his general required anything. And then she heard his voice, sharp with a pain she recognized, a pain she had tried so desperately to soothe. A cage, Marius. A beautiful, sunlit cage. The words seeped through the thick oak of the door, muffled but clear. Each one a perfectly aimed dart, piercing the fragile armor of her heart. Before her, my life was my own. I was free. Her hand fell to her side. The basket slipped from her numb fingers, landing on the cold stone floor with a soft, hollow thud. She didn't even register the sound. Her entire world had narrowed to the voice on the other side of that door, his voice, twisting love into a restraint, twisting her presence into a prison. It is a burden, Marius. A beautiful, terrible burden. A burden. The word from the study, now given its full, devastating context. She was not a partner. She was a weight. She was the loss of his freedom. The anchor that would drown him. She backed away from the door, one step, then another, her movements stiff and robotic. A coldness she had never known, a chill that had nothing to do with the castle's stone, spread through her veins, turning her blood to ice water. She did not cry. The pain was too sharp, too deep for tears. It was a clean wound, a severing. She looked down the long, torchlit corridor, the path back to her chambers, to their chambers. It had always seemed like home. Now, it looked like the gilded bars of the cage he spoke of. A profound, terrible clarity settled over her. She had been so focused on loving him, she had never truly considered what her love was costing him. He felt trapped. And if you truly love something, you do not keep it in a cage. You set it free. The thought was not born of anger, but of a sorrow so vast it felt like the sky. She turned, her steps silent on the stone, and walked away from the armory, leaving the little basket lying forgotten in the shadows. Elara's chambers, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum for a love that had just died. The air was thick with memories, each object a testament to a life she now understood as a lie. She walked through the rooms, her bare feet silent on the cool marble floors, touching things as if seeing them for the first time. The heavy velvet curtains, the color of a midnight sky, that he had commissioned because she loved to watch the stars. The vanity table, its surface cluttered with silver-backed brushes and crystal perfume bottles, gifts from their travels. The enormous, canopied bed, its sheets still holding the faint, cold scent of his skin and the lingering warmth from her own body. It was all a stage, a beautifully crafted set for a play in which she had been the only one who didn't know her part was a tragedy. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. His words echoed in her mind, a relentless, cruel chorus. A cage. A burden. I was free. She had seen the restlessness in him, the flicker of the predator behind the king's weary eyes. She had thought her love could soothe it, could be a balm for the wounds of his long, lonely existence. She had been so arrogant. She had mistaken his tolerance for acceptance, his affection for contentment. She was not a balm, she was a chain. A human chain, fragile and short-lived, but a chain nonetheless. The pain was a physical thing, a great, hollow ache in her chest. But beneath the pain, a quiet, resolute purpose began to form. He felt trapped by her, by the life they had built. He yearned for the freedom he had before her. And she loved him. Dear gods, she loved him more than her own life, more than the sun and the moon and the very air she breathed. Her love for him was the most real thing she had ever known. And that love demanded a sacrifice. Not his, but hers. She would not confront him. There would be no tearful accusations, no dramatic scenes. That would only be another burden, another emotional demand placed upon him. It would force him to lie, to soothe her, to double his performance of a contented man. It would be a cruelty. No, her departure had to be as quiet and unobtrusive as her presence had apparently become. An act of liberation, not abandonment. A gift. Her mind, once clouded with grief, became ruthlessly clear. She stood and walked to the ornate armoire, pulling it open. Gowns of silk and velvet, shimmering with thread of gold, hung like sleeping ghosts. The Queen's wardrobe. She pushed them aside, reaching for the back, for the simple, sturdy woolen dress and cloak she had arrived in all those years ago. They had kept it, a sentimental token of her past. Now, it was her future. She moved through the room with a new, somber grace. She gathered a few things, small, practical, and hers alone. A small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her own thoughts, not stories of his kingdom. A comb carved from applewood, a gift from her father. She paused at her jewelry box, lifting the heavy lid. It was filled with a king's ransom in gems, diamonds like frozen stars, rubies like drops of blood, sapphires as deep as the twilight sky. Gifts from him. Chains, all of them. She closed the lid. She would take nothing that tied her to this life, to this role. Finally, she sat at the small writing desk by the window. The moon was high now, a perfect, cold circle in the black sky, illuminating the snow-dusted peaks outside. She took out a single sheet of cream-colored parchment, the kind he used for his personal correspondence. She dipped a quill in a pot of ink, her hand surprisingly steady. What could she say? How could she distill years of love and a universe of heartbreak into a few lines? How could she make him understand that this was an act of love, not of spite? She kept it simple. The truth, stripped of all accusation. She wrote only 3 sentences, her elegant script a stark contrast to the brutal simplicity of the words. She did not sign it with her title. She did not sign it with a flourish. Just her name. Ilara. She folded the small piece of paper, the crease sharp and final. She would leave it on his pillow, in the hollow where her head should be. A quiet, undeniable statement of her absence. She looked around the room one last time, memorizing the fall of moonlight on the floor, the shape of the shadows in the corners. It was a beautiful cage. But the door was open, and she was going to fly. Not for herself. For him. The hours before dawn were the quietest in the keep, a time of deep, suspended animation. The torches in the corridors burned low, their flames barely flickering. The guards stood like statues at their posts, lost in the hypnotic rhythm of the long watch. It was into this profound silence that Ilara slipped away, a ghost in her own home. She wore the simple brown wool of her old life, the rough fabric a shocking, grounding contrast to the silks she had grown accustomed to. Her cloak, the color of moss and earth, was pulled up, the hood shadowing her face. She carried nothing but a small cloth satchel containing her journal, her comb, and a small purse of coins, her own, saved from the allowance she was given for personal charities. Enough to start over. Enough to disappear. She moved through the castle's sleeping arteries with a knowledge born of years of residency. She knew the flagstones that were loose, the tapestries that hid forgotten passages, the routes the night patrols took. She was a phantom, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the cold stone. She passed the great hall, its long tables empty, haunted by the ghosts of 1,000 feasts. She passed the throne room, the twin thrones of obsidian and silver sitting empty in the gloom, symbols of a power she had never wanted and was now relinquishing. Her last stop was their chambers. His chambers now. She pushed the heavy door open a fraction of an inch, just enough to slip through. The room was dark, save for the faint, dying glow of the embers in the hearth. Kazima was asleep in the center of the vast bed, a still, pale figure lost in the white expanse of the linens. He looked younger in sleep, the harsh lines of his face softened, the weight of centuries momentarily lifted. His black hair was a dark spill against the pillows, the silver at his temples catching the faint emberlight like threads of captured moonlight. She approached the bed, her heart a painful, hammering drum in the silence. It took every ounce of her will not to reach out and touch him, to trace the line of his jaw, to feel the impossible coolness of his skin one last time. This was the man she loved. The man who felt burdened by that love. She could smell the faint scent of wine on his breath, see the subtle, slow rise and fall of his chest. He was so beautiful, a creature of perfect, lethal grace. A king of shadows. And she, a daughter of the sun, had cast a shadow over him. With trembling fingers, she retrieved the folded note from her cloak. She gently, carefully, placed it on the pillow beside his head, right in the indentation where she would have laid her final words, resting where her final breath of the night would have been. She allowed herself one last, long look. She memorized the way a lock of his hair fell across his brow, the proud arch of his nose, the severe, beautiful curve of his lips. A single, hot tear finally escaped, tracing a silent path down her cheek. She brushed it away angrily. This was not about her grief. It was about his freedom. She backed away from the bed, silent as a sigh. She slipped out of the room, pulling the door shut with a barely audible click. The sound was deafeningly final. Her journey out of the keep was a blur of shadows and stone. She used a small, rarely used postern gate on the eastern wall, one that led to the old kitchens and was manned by a single, sleepy guard who barely glanced her way. She was just a servant girl, leaving before dawn to run an errand in the village below. No one looked twice. And then, she was outside. The air hit her with a physical force, so cold and clean it stole her breath. It smelled of pine and snow and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming dawn. The sky above was a deep, star-dusted indigo, beginning to pale at the eastern horizon. She stood for a moment at the edge of the forest that bordered the castle grounds, and looked back at the obsidian keep. It rose against the dark sky like a shard of night itself, a fortress of power and loneliness. Her home. Her prison. His prison. She pulled her hood tighter around her face, turned her back on the only life she had known for 5 years, and walked into the welcoming darkness of the woods, not looking back. The path was uncertain, the future a terrifying, blank page. But with every step she took away from him, she whispered the same thing in her heart, a mantra of love and sorrow. You are free. You are free. You are free. Cazima woke slowly, drifting up from a deep, dreamless sleep. The first thing he registered was the silence. Not the usual pre-dawn hush of the castle, but a profound, unnerving stillness in the room itself. The air was cold, stagnant. He reached out, his hand moving through empty space, seeking the familiar warmth of Alara's body beside him. He found only cold, rumpled linen. His eyes snapped open. The room was steeped in the grey, liminal light of first dawn. The fire was dead, a pile of pale ash in the hearth. The space beside him in the bed was empty. A faint indentation in the pillow was the only sign she had been there at all. He sat up, a disquieting feeling coiling in his gut. She was an early riser, yes, but she never left without a soft kiss to his brow, a whispered goodbye that he would pretend to sleep through. His gaze fell upon the object resting on her pillow. A small, folded square of cream-colored parchment. It was not her journal, not a book. It was a note. Addressed to no one. Yet, it was undeniably for him. A cold dread, unfamiliar and sharp, pierced through the lingering haze of sleep. He reached for it, his movements suddenly stiff. The paper was cool to the touch, fragile. Mortal. He unfolded it. The script was hers. Elegant, precise, achingly familiar. The words were few, but they struck him with the force of a physical blow, each one a shard of ice in his veins. You are free. I will always love you. Ilara. He stared at the note, the ink stark against the pale paper. He read the words again. And again. They made no sense. Free. Free from what? His mind, usually so sharp, so quick, felt sluggish, wrapped in cotton. And then, like the thunderclap that follows a lightning strike, his own voice echoed back to him from the cold, metallic confines of the armory. A cage, Marius. A beautiful, sunlit cage. Before her, my life was my own. I was free. It is a burden, Marius. A beautiful, terrible burden. A strangled sound escaped his throat, a noise somewhere between a gasp and a sob. No. She couldn't have heard. It was impossible. He had been in the armory, deep in the castle's belly. She had been, where had she been? He remembered her now, in his study, her quiet concern, the way her hand had flinched on his shoulder when he'd used that word. Burdens. The dread solidified into a sickening, gut-twisting certainty. She had heard. She had heard his ugly, selfish, ungrateful confession, and she had taken it not as the momentary weakness of a tired man, but as the fundamental truth of his heart. And in her infinite, heartbreaking goodness, she had acted upon it. She hadn't fought, she hadn't cried, she hadn't accused. She had simply granted his wish. You are free. He crushed the note in his fist, the delicate paper crumpling into a ruined ball. No, he whispered to the empty room, the word a raw, ragged thing. He threw back the covers, his feet hitting the cold floor. He was on his feet, pacing, a caged animal. The room, his vast, opulent chamber, suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in. He looked at the bed, at the empty space where she should be, and a wave of panic, so pure and so potent it nearly brought him to his knees, washed over him. He had craved freedom. He had romanticized the idea of his solitary, uncomplicated past. He had chafed under the perceived constraints of her love. And now, in the space of a single, silent night, he had it. And it was not the clean, cold relief he had imagined. It was this vast, echoing emptiness. This hollow, aching void where her warmth used to be. A roar of pure, unadulterated anguish tore from his throat, a sound not heard in the castle for centuries. It was the sound of a predator caught in a trap of his own making. He swept his arm across the bedside table, sending a silver pitcher and goblet crashing to the floor. He stalked to the vanity, his reflection a pale, monstrous stranger in the mirror. He saw her things, her brush, with a single, long brown hair still tangled in the bristles. He picked it up, his hand trembling, the delicate strand a relic of a life that was already gone. The freedom he had whined about was a lie, a childish fantasy. His life before her hadn't been freedom, it had been a grey, meaningless eternity. She was not the anchor that would drown him. She was the anchor that had kept him from drifting away into the cold, empty abyss of his own immortality. She was the one who had taught him the sun could still be warm. And he had driven her away with careless, cruel words. He had broken the most precious thing he had ever possessed. He stared at his own reflection, at the ancient grief welling in his eyes, and for the first time in 700 years, King Kazima was truly, utterly, and hopelessly trapped. The king's grief was a storm that broke over the obsidian keep. It began with the primal roar that had shaken the dust from ancient tapestries and sent a tremor of fear through the waking castle staff. It was followed by a terrifying, destructive whirlwind. Kazima, in a blind fury of regret, tore their chambers apart. He ripped the velvet curtains from their rods, overturned the heavy mahogany furniture, and shattered the crystal perfume bottles against the wall, filling the air with a cacophony of competing scents that only sharpened the agony of her absence. He was a tempest of black silk and pale rage, destroying the beautiful cage he had lamented, only to find the destruction brought him no release, only a deeper, more profound emptiness. When the fury spent itself, it left behind a chilling, unnatural stillness. He stood in the wreckage of their room, his chest heaving, the crumpled note still clutched in his white-knuckled fist. The sun was fully risen now, its pale winter light streaming through the bare windows, illuminating the devastation. It looked like a tomb. Then came the performance. He summoned the captain of the guard, his voice a low, dangerous command that brooked no argument. "The queen is missing," he stated, the words like stones in his mouth. "Find her." Within the hour, the keep was a hive of frantic activity. Search parties were organized, their banners snapping in the cold wind as they rode out in every direction. Guardsmen swarmed the castle grounds, their hounds baying, their voices calling her name into the unforgiving winter air. "Ilara, Your Majesty." The calls echoed off the stone walls and died in the silent, snow-dusted forest. Kazima stood on the main balcony, watching them go, a perfect portrait of a distraught king. But he knew. It was a charade. He knew they would not find her. She did not want to be found. And he, with his careless tongue, had given her every reason to disappear. Marius found him there, his old general's face grim. He stood beside his king, looking out at the flurry of activity below. "My king," he began, his voice heavy. Kazima didn't turn. "She's gone, Marius," he said, his own voice hollow, devoid of all its former power. "She heard me. In the armory. She heard it all." Marius's shoulders slumped, a rare break in his stoic composure. He had no words of comfort, no easy platitudes. He had been there. He was a witness to the crime. "I am sorry, Kazima," he said, using the name from their youth, a name that spoke of a time before crowns and terrible mistakes. "She thinks I wanted this," Kazima whispered, his gaze fixed on the distant forest where she must have gone. He could almost feel her, a fading warmth on the edge of his senses. She thinks she was a burden. A chain. She left to set me free. A terrible, broken laugh escaped him. And here I am. Free. The castle is mine again. The knights are my own. The kingdom bows to my every whim. It is everything I thought I wanted. He finally turned to face Marius, his eyes dark with a despair so profound it seemed to suck the very light from the air. And it is utterly worthless. It is a hell of my own making. He left the balcony and stalked through the castle, a ghost haunting the halls of his own life. He found himself standing outside the armory, the heavy oak door a silent accuser. He could almost hear the echo of his own arrogant, foolish words. He pushed the door open. The room was just as they had left it, cold, orderly, smelling of steel and oil. But in the shadows near the entrance, something lay on the floor. A small, woven basket. He bent and picked it up. It was empty. He remembered then, a flash of a memory, Elara, mentioning something about honeycakes, a childish treat he'd once loved. She had been coming here. For him. With a gift. And he had met her with the cruelest words he had ever spoken. He clutched the basket to his chest, the rough weave pressing into his fine tunic. This small, empty object was a more damning indictment than any spoken accusation. He sank to his knees on the cold stone floor of the armory, the king of a vast and powerful domain, brought low by a simple, empty basket and the weight of a freedom he had never truly wanted. The search parties would ride for days, their efforts futile. The court would whisper, their theories ranging from abduction to elopement. But Cazimir would know the truth. He was alone. Utterly and completely alone, trapped in the echoing silence of his own regret. The freedom he had craved was not a release, it was a sentence. And his reign as the loneliest creature on earth had just begun. Autumn bled into winter, and winter thawed into a tentative spring. In a small, sun-drenched valley hundreds of leagues to the south, the town of Oakhaven woke from its slumber. The snow melted from the thatched roofs, feeding the boisterous creek that ran through the town center, and the first crocuses pushed their way through the damp earth like tiny purple jewels. It was in this town, a place so steeped in the simple, cyclical rhythms of mortal life that it felt like another world, that Elara had begun to build a new existence. She had found a small, clean room for rent above the town's bakery. Her days started with the warm, comforting scent of rising bread and ended with the quiet chirping of crickets in the fields beyond the town's edge. Her new life was a tapestry woven from small, quiet moments. She had taken a position at the town's bookshop, a dusty, magical place run by a kindly old woman named Anya, whose eyesight was failing but whose memory for stories was encyclopedic. Elara spent her days surrounded by the scent of paper and ink, her slender fingers cataloguing new arrivals, mending torn pages, and recommending tales of adventure and romance to the townspeople. She was no longer Queen Elara. Here, she was just Elara, the quiet, gentle woman from the north with a sad, soft look in her eyes and a love for books. The townspeople, with their rural practicality and innate kindness, accepted her without many questions. They saw a woman seeking peace and gave it to her. She was lonely, a deep, persistent ache that sat in her chest like a smooth, heavy stone. At night, in her small room, with the scent of cooling bread wafting up through the floorboards, the memories would come. The memory of his cool hand in hers, the sound of his low laugh in the quiet of their library, the way he looked at her sometimes, a look of such raw, desperate tenderness it had made her feel like the center of the universe. She would curl up in her narrow bed, the ache so sharp it felt like a physical wound, and she would remind herself why she had left. For his freedom. She had to believe it was the right thing to do. She had to believe he was happier now, unburdened. The thought was both her comfort and her torment. But she was not broken. There was a quiet strength in her that she hadn't known she possessed. The Elara who had been queen had been defined by him, by her love for him, by her place in his world. This Elara, the bookseller in Oakhaven, was defined by herself. She found a quiet joy in the small things, the warmth of a mug of tea in her hands on a cool morning, the laughter of children playing by the creek, the satisfaction of finding the perfect book for a lonely farmer's boy. She took long walks in the woods that bordered the valley, her feet finding a steady rhythm on the mossy earth. She learned the names of the local wildflowers and the calls of the birds. One crisp spring afternoon, a little girl with bright red pigtails came into the shop, clutching a coin in her small fist. She wanted a book with a dragon, but a nice dragon, not a scary one. Alara spent 20 minutes patiently searching the shelves with her, finally unearthing a well-loved copy of a tale about a lonely dragon who befriended a lost princess. The girl's face lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. As the girl left, clutching her treasure, Anya smiled from her seat behind the counter. "You have a gift for it, dear," the old woman said, her voice raspy. "You find what people are looking for, even when they don't know it themselves." Alara smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "I just like stories with happy endings," she said softly. She looked out the shop window at the sunlit street, at the simple, beautiful tapestry of life unfolding. She was healing. The wound of her old life was still there, a tender scar on her heart, but it was no longer gaping, no longer bleeding. She was Alara of Oakhaven. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like it might just be enough. She was surviving. And in her own quiet way, she was free, too. While Alara found a fragile peace in the sunlight of Oakhaven, Kazima descended into a private, frozen hell. The kingdom of his ancestors, a domain he had ruled with cold, precise efficiency for centuries, became his prison. The walls of the Obsidian Keep, once a symbol of his power, now served only to contain his boundless regret. Winter had seized his lands with a brutal, unrelenting grip, and it felt as though the frost had seeped through the stone and into his very soul. He had called off the search. After 2 weeks of futile effort, of his guards returning empty-handed with frostbitten faces and apologetic eyes, he had dismissed them with a wave of his hand. It was a lie, a performance, and he was tired of it. He knew she was not in his lands. He knew she had fled to the world of men, a world where he, with his pale skin and ancient eyes, could not easily follow without causing terror and bloodshed. A world he had sworn to her he would not harm. His days became a grey, meaningless blur. He neglected his duties, leaving the tedious work of ruling to a weary, overburdened Marius. The council chambers, once the stage for his power, now sat empty. He could not bear the simpering courtiers, the endless petitions, the hollow echo of his own voice in the vast hall. He retreated into the shadows of the keep, a ghost in his own palace. His nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only a black, empty void. He stopped feeding. The primal hunger that had defined his existence for a millennium faded to a dull, distant ache, easily ignored. His strength began to wane. The sharp, predatory senses that had kept him alive for ages grew dull, muted. His courtiers whispered in the hallways, their voices hushed with fear and concern. They saw their immortal king fading before their eyes, consumed by a grief they could not comprehend. He spent his hours in her rooms. He had forbidden the servants from cleaning the wreckage he had made, but after a week of living in the chaos, he had slowly, painstakingly, put everything back in its place. He mended the torn curtains with his own clumsy, unpracticed fingers. He righted the furniture. He swept up the shattered crystal. He was the curator of a museum of his own pain. He would sit for hours in the chair by the window where she used to read, her favorite book of poetry open in his lap, his eyes tracing the words his mind could not absorb. He would lie in their vast, cold bed, his hand resting on the empty space beside him, trying to conjure the memory of her warmth, the scent of her skin. He opened her jewelry box, the gems winking mockingly in the gloom. He picked up a sapphire necklace, a string of cold, blue stones like frozen tears. He remembered the night he had given it to her, the way it had looked against the warm, living column of her throat, the way she had laughed, her eyes shining brighter than any gem. The memory was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. This was the freedom he had so foolishly craved. The freedom to be utterly, completely alone. The freedom to haunt the ruins of his own happiness. His immortality, once a source of pride and power, had become his curse. It promised him an eternity of this, an endless expanse of winters, each one as cold and empty as his own heart. He would watch the world turn, watch civilizations rise and fall, and he would be here, in this castle, with her ghost, forever paying the price for a few careless, resentful words. He was no longer a king. He was a prisoner, sentenced to a life of solitary confinement in a cell of his own making, with only the memory of what he had lost for company. And he knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that he deserved every second of it. Nearly a year had passed. The seasons had turned with a relentless indifference, a full cycle of the mortal world that Kazima had barely registered. Spring had given way to a hot, heavy summer, which had now mellowed into the crisp, melancholic beauty of autumn. The forests around the Obsidian Keep were ablaze with color, the leaves turning brilliant shades of crimson and gold before dying and falling to the earth. The sight, once a source of grim satisfaction, now only reminded him of her. Brief, beautiful, and gone. He was a shadow of his former self. The sharp, aristocratic planes of his face were now gaunt, his eyes sunken and haunted, burning with a low, feverish light in the darkness of his self-imposed exile. He rarely left her chambers, which he now kept as a perfect, sterile shrine. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was touched. It was a room holding its breath. One evening, as a hunter's moon rose over the jagged peaks, a memory ambushed him. It was not a grand memory of a state dinner or a royal tour. It was small, simple, and utterly devastating. It was the memory of the harvest festival, 2 years prior. Elara had convinced him to attend the celebration in the village square, to walk among the people not as their feared king, but as a man. She had woven autumn flowers into her hair, her face flushed with excitement and the warmth from the great bonfire. She had dragged him into a country dance, her laughter ringing out in the cool night air, bright and clear as a silver bell. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, warm and alive. He remembered the dizzying, unfamiliar sensation of being pulled into the joyful, chaotic circle of the dance, surrounded by the smiling faces of his mortal subjects. And he remembered the look in her eyes when she had looked up at him, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. It was a look of pure, unadulterated love, a look that saw past the monster and the myth and saw only him. In that moment, surrounded by her warmth and light, he had not felt like a king, or a vampire, or a relic of a bygone age. He had felt happy. Simply, terrifyingly happy. The memory struck him with the force of a physical impact. It shattered the cold, brittle shell of grief he had built around himself, and the pain underneath was raw, immediate, and unbearable. The quiet, persistent ache he had lived with for a year erupted into an agony so profound he cried out, a ragged, broken sound that was swallowed by the tapestries on the walls. He staggered to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The moonlit landscape outside was a vista of silent, silvered beauty, but he saw none of it. All he saw was her face, her laughing eyes, her smile. All he felt was the ghost of her hand in his. And in that moment, something inside him finally, irrevocably broke. The lie he had been telling himself that he deserved this torment, that his punishment was to live without her, crumbled to dust. His immortality was not a sentence to be endured in solitude. It was a chance. A chance he was squandering, rotting away in this castle of regret. What was the point of eternity if it was empty? What was the point of power if it could not mend the one thing that mattered? He would not command her to return. He would not use his power to drag her back to a life she had fled. He had no right. But he could not continue like this. He could not live in this mausoleum for one more night. A new purpose, born of desperation and a final, flickering ember of hope, solidified in his heart. He would find her. Not to reclaim her as his queen. Not to imprison her again in his gilded cage. He would find her simply to stand before her, as a man, and speak the truth. He would tell her she was not a burden, but his salvation. He would tell her she was not a cage, but the only freedom he had ever known. He would tell her he was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool who had not known the value of the sun until he had plunged himself into eternal darkness. He would go to her and he would apologize. He would beg for her forgiveness, even though he knew he did not deserve it. And if she sent him away, if she told him to return to his shadows and leave her to her life, he would obey. He would accept her judgment. But he had to try. He had to see her face one more time. He had to let her hear the truth of his broken heart. He turned from the window, his movements no longer slow and spectral, but filled with a new, feverish energy. He strode from her chambers, leaving the door open behind him, letting the life of the castle back into the stagnant air. He found Marius in the great hall, poring over maps. "Marius," he said, his voice raw but firm. "You have the rule of this kingdom. I do not know when I will return." The old general looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of his king. He saw not the fading ghost of the past year, but a man on fire, a man with a purpose, however desperate. He saw the king he had once known. Marius simply nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. "Go, my king," he said. Find your heart. Cazimir did not wait for another dawn. He shed his royal silks for the simple, dark garb of a traveler. He took no guards, no retinue. He took only a horse, a purse of gold, and the small, empty basket he had kept hidden in his rooms for a year. Under the light of the hunter's moon, he rode out from the obsidian keep, not as a king, but as a supplicant. A penitent, heading south, chasing the ghost of a memory and the slimmest, most impossible chance of redemption. The journey south was a pilgrimage through a world he had only ever observed from a distance. Cazimir traveled by night, sleeping in hidden groves and forgotten ruins by day, the sun a painful, accusatory glare even through the thickest canopy. He was a creature of shadow moving through a world of light, and the contrast had never felt so stark. The world of men was so vibrant, so noisy, so messy. It was teeming with life, with color, with the chaotic, beautiful, fleeting energy of mortality. He saw villages celebrating births, families mourning losses, lovers quarreling in town squares, merchants hawking their wares with loud, boisterous cries. Every scene was a small, poignant drama, a reminder of the world Alara had come from, and the world she had returned to. He had no map to guide him, only a direction, south, and a faint, almost imperceptible pull on his senses. A lingering trace of her essence, a psychic thread that had weakened over the year but had never completely broken. It was a fool's hope, chasing a whisper on the wind, but it was all he had. Weeks turned into a month. He crossed mountains and forded rivers, his fine traveler's clothes becoming worn and stained, his face shadowed with a dark stubble. He looked less like a king and more like a wanderer, a man haunted by a past he could not outrun. Finally, the thread grew stronger. It led him to a sun-drenched valley nestled between gentle, rolling hills, a place that seemed untouched by the harshness of the world. A sign at the edge of the road, carved into a piece of weathered oak, read, Oakhaven. The name meant nothing to him, but the pull was undeniable now, a clear, certain hum in his blood. She was here. He entered the town as dusk began to fall, the time of day when his world and hers bled into one another. Oakhaven was peaceful. The houses were made of warm-colored stone and timber, with smoke curling lazily from their chimneys. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and baking bread. It was so utterly, painfully domestic. He felt ancient, alien, a shard of midnight in a world of soft twilight hues. He tethered his horse near the town square and walked, his boots silent on the cobblestone streets. He drew a few curious glances, his height, his pallor, the unnatural stillness of his posture marked him as an outsider, but the townspeople quickly returned to their business. And then he saw it. A small shop with a swinging sign that depicted an open book. Anya's Books, it read. The pull was strongest here. It emanated from this place like a gentle warmth. He stopped across the street, concealed in the deepening shadows of a blacksmith's forge. He looked through the shop's large, mullioned window. The interior was lit by the warm, golden glow of a few oil lamps. And there, behind the counter, stacking a pile of books, was Alara. The sight of her struck him with the force of a physical blow. He forgot how to breathe. She was the same, yet different. Her hair was simpler, tied back in a loose braid. She wore a plain, homespun dress the color of autumn leaves. The haunted, fragile look she'd had in the last months at the keep was gone. Her face, illuminated by the lamplight, was calm, serene. She looked content. The sight was both the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and the most devastating. She had built a life without him. A good life. A peaceful life. Who was he to shatter it? For a long moment, he considered turning around. He could leave now, leave her to this peace she had so clearly earned. It would be the noble thing to do. But the memory of his empty, silent castle, of the endless, grey expanse of the years stretching before him, was too powerful. He could not. He had to speak to her. He waited. He waited as she spoke to a customer, her smile soft and genuine. He waited as she swept the floor, her movements graceful and unhurried. He waited until the last customer had left and she had turned the sign on the door to closed. He took a deep, steadying breath that did nothing to calm the frantic, dead beating of his heart. He clutched the small basket he had carried all this way. Then, he stepped out of the shadows and crossed the street. The small bell above the door chimed, a bright, intrusive sound in the quiet shop. Alara looked up from the ledger she was closing, a polite smile on her face. I'm sorry, the words died on her lips. Her smile vanished. The color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as he was. It was him. Standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the last vestiges of twilight. He was thinner, his face gaunt and shadowed, but it was unmistakably him. Her heart leaped into her throat, a wild, terrified bird. Fear, pain, and a tidal wave of a love she had tried so desperately to bury washed over her all at once. Cazimir did not move. He did not cross the threshold. He stood in the doorway, a king no longer, just a man, a supplicant. He looked at her, his eyes, those ancient, sorrowful eyes, filled with a universe of pain and regret. Ilara, he said. Her name was a raw, broken whisper, a prayer on the evening air. She stared at him, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to keep herself steady. What are you doing here? She managed to ask, her voice trembling. I was wrong, he said, the words rushing out, desperate and unadorned. Everything I said. Everything you heard. It was the lie of a fool who did not know what he had. My life before you was not freedom. It was emptiness. A long, grey, meaningless waiting. I didn't know what waiting for, until I found you. He took a single, hesitant step into the shop, his gaze never leaving hers. You are not a burden. You were never a burden. You were my anchor, yes, but not the kind that drowns. The kind that keeps a ship from being smashed against the rocks. The kind that holds it safe in a storm. You were the only real thing in my entire, endless life. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and immediate. Tears of shock, of old pain, of a new, bewildering hope. He stopped a few feet from the counter, holding up the small, empty basket. I found this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You were coming to me. With a gift. And I repaid you with cruelty. He set the basket on the counter between them. I am not here to command you. I am not here to ask you to return to that life. I am here to apologize. And to beg your forgiveness, though I know I have no right to it. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze any longer, his vulnerability a raw, open wound. I have been living in a prison of my own making for a year, Ilara. And I have learned that the only freedom that matters is the freedom to be with you. If you tell me to leave, I will go. I will leave you to this peace you have made, and I will never bother you again. But I had to tell you. I had to let you know the truth. The silence that followed was immense, filled with the weight of everything unsaid for a year. Ilara looked at the man before her, not the powerful king, but a broken, penitent man, laying his heart bare on the floor of her little bookshop. She saw the truth of his words in the depths of his haunted eyes. Slowly, carefully, she came around the counter. She stopped in front of him. The air between them crackled. She could reach out and touch him. After a year of dreaming of it, he was here. She did not offer immediate forgiveness. The wound had been too deep. But she saw his pain, and it mirrored her own. They were two halves of a whole, broken by a foolish mistake. She slowly raised her hand, not to push him away, but to gently touch his cheek. His skin was as cool as she remembered, but a tremor ran through him at her touch. He closed his eyes, leaning into her palm as if it were the only warmth in the universe. Cazimir, she whispered. He opened his eyes. They were shining with unshed tears. She did not say I forgive you, she did not say I will come back, she said something far more important. Talk to me, she said, her voice soft but firm. Tell me everything. No more silence. A single tear finally traced a path down his pale cheek. He nodded, unable to speak. He reached out and took her hand, his cool fingers lacing with her warm ones. It was not an ending. It was not even a promise of a perfect future. But it was a beginning. A chance, taken from the ashes of regret, to build something new. Not a king and his queen in a gilded cage, but two souls, finally free to be vulnerable, to be honest, to be together. And as he held her hand, Cazimir understood. This was freedom. This was all it had ever been.